Well, it's 72 degrees out here right now, and I thought I would go up close to the tulip magnolia to see how it's doing, and it looks pretty. I can hear birds. So I thought I'd tell you a story about how I ended up in Charlottesville, because I thought I was moving to Oregon. I was working in Washington, and I got to the point where I just couldn't stand living there anymore. I was living in Arlington and riding the metro and everything, the buses down into town, and I had these clients that over the years they had left Washington and they had moved out to Oregon. I think they went to Eugene, and they ended up coming back after a couple of years, and so they told me stories about how wonderful it was out there and how they really wanted to go back. So I got it in my mind that I would set that as a goal. And so what I had to do was start saving money, because it was very hard to save any money there, because it took practically everything you had to pay the rent and just make ends meet. So I started putting money aside, and I looked at it practically daily. I think what I was doing, I was putting my tips away. And then this took a year. So I ended up subscribing to Oregon Coast magazine, and it was beautiful. I just felt like, and I love the ocean. So I had that as the image of where I was going to go. And then as we got closer to the time when I was going to go and fly out to Portland, and then I rented a car, and first I drove over to the coast, and then I went down to Eugene, and I hung out for a couple of days, and I got to know some of the locals. And one of the things that really disappointed me about Oregon was the logging, because as I drove around through the countryside, all of a sudden there would be like a whole hillside that didn't have a tree on it. And so I for 3 days I looked to see about renting an apartment, and apparently I was there at the wrong time, because I was there at the beginning of May, and I was used to the universities back here on the East Coast that the classes would end in May, and then apartments would become available for the beginning of June. Well, the U of O is on a different schedule, and so here I was once again not doing my research, and so they didn't end until June, and then so the apartments really weren't available at that time. So what I decided to do was to just drive the entire Oregon coast all the way down into Northern California. And I already knew it pretty well, because I'd been studying it and looking at the magazine pictures, and I knew the names of the towns and everything. And there were some times where I actually had to turn around and drive drive back up again and then drive back down because the scenes were just so breathtaking, you know, with the way the mountains went right down into the ocean. And then, of course, it looked different from the other angle. And so I ended up going down into Northern California, and I wanted to see an old growth forest. So I went to a ranger station and I said, you know, I want to see trees, you know, that have never been cut, and just an old growth forest. And so there weren't very many around, not much of it was old growth like that, and plus I wasn't in the part of California that had the gigantic trees. So they were very tall, but they weren't really big around. So they directed me over to what they called a stout grove. So I got in there, and it was a piece of forest that was probably about 5 miles long by 2 miles wide. And as soon as I drove into it, like onto the gravel road and get into it, there was such a spiritual feeling. It was like the feeling that I got when I would go into a cathedral in Europe. You know, there was just, I was overwhelmed by, you know, the spirit of the earth and the spirit of God, and, you know, just the reverence of just nature. So, even the colors were different. You know, I noticed that right away, is that just the colors of like the underbrush and you know, the colors of just the trees and whatever. So what I ended up doing is I drove about halfway through, and there was not another car in there. It was on a weekday. And I got out of the car and I walked over between these two huge redwood trees. And like I said, they weren't really big around, but they were really tall. And I put my arms out and I said out loud to the universe, what am I supposed to do? And I swear to God, I heard Charlottesville spoken into my head as if somebody was saying it right in, you know, in my ear and in my head. And so it kind of like caught me off guard because, you know, I never had an experience where I heard a voice. And so I sort of had this, oh, I'm looking for a small college town, and I don't have to go all the way out to Oregon to find it. It's 100 miles down the road from where I am right now. So, of course, I'd heard of Charlottesville. I'd never been here. So I finished off my trip, and I went to Crater Lake, but you couldn't get into it because there was still snow on the roads, so I couldn't actually see Crater Lake. But then I got back up to Portland, and I came back to National Airport, and then I never had a car the whole time I lived in Washington. So I rented a car, and the very next day I drove down here to Charlottesville, and I stayed in the Super 8 Motel. And when I went down to the downtown mall, I was like absolutely delighted because there was fresh air, there was trees, there were people, there were outdoor cafes, you know, there was life and a slowness that I didn't have up in Washington. You know, it's like a much more real kind of life, you know, not the hustle and bustle. So I looked through the newspaper, and the very next day I made an appointment to go look at an apartment, and there was a young woman who had just moved out of it. She went to Piedmont Community College, and so when I was talking to the landlord, I said, I'll take it, because I was afraid if I didn't take it right then, somebody else would get it. So by the end of the month, I was all packed up, and I rented a truck, and I had some guys pack the truck for me. It was like students. And then I drove the truck down with 2 cats in the cab of the truck with me. And then when I got down here, I had already made an appointment with somebody that I'd seen a flyer from this guy called the Moving Man. So he and his son came over and unpacked my truck. And then I had to drive the truck over to the rental place and then take a taxi home. And I had gotten a bicycle before I came down here. So for more than a year, all I had was a bicycle. And I found a job right away down around the university, and it was just getting into summer. So I didn't have very many clients, and I had a lot of time to sit on the porch swing and watch the trains go by. And by the next winter, well, actually that whole next winter I had to ride my bicycle, but then by the next winter I had a car. And then everything kind of just little by little, you know, I stayed in that apartment for 3 years, and then I moved over to another apartment, and then I stayed there for 7 years, and during that time my sister moved here from Phoenix. So and now I've been here 30 years. So anyway, I was guided to move here, and I could not be happier. Everything seems to be working out just fine in my life right now, and I'm going to stay where I am now that I've moved. I don't have any obligations, so all I have to do is settle and downsize. So talk to you guys later.